Now, patients with left hemisphere damage whose right hand is paralyzed, or indeed a majority of patients with right hemisphere damage and left arm is paralyzed, will not do this. They'll say, I can't clap, doctor, my left arm is paralyzed. That's the natural response that you expect. But these patients with this extraordinary syndrome, which we call anosognosia, where the patient is denying or playing down the fact that the left arm is paralyzed. Okay. Can you show me? Can you touch my nose with your right hand? Touch my nose. Yeah. Excellent. Now, can you do it with your left hand, please?
I think so.
Okay. Can you do it for me?
I'll try.
Okay, that's fine. Are you doing it?
Wait a minute. I'm calling up my left hand.
You're calling it up? Okay.
Get in there.
Okay. All right. Is it touching my left?
No.
My nose?
Yeah, I'm still talking to it.
You're still talking to it?
I'm explaining to it what to do.
You're explaining to it what to do. Okay. Is it listening?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But it's reacting slowly.
It's reacting slowly. Okay.
It's tired, I think.
It's tired. Okay. Thank you very much. Many of these patients, the remarks they make to account for the left hand's failure to perform, the statements they make often sound a little bit humorous, often tinged with a perverse sense of humor. And you start wondering about some of Freud's ideas about humor itself being used as a defense mechanism. Is that what the patient doing?
Ella Sinclair is another stroke victim with a paralysed left side. She also has anosognosia, and she too seems to use humour to deny her paralysis.
Now you remember when I first saw you, I was asking you whether you could use your left hand. What did you tell me then?
I think I told you yes.
You told me yes, you could use it.
But I lied.
You lied? Well, why did you lie to me?
I don't know, you wasn't smiling at me, I guess.
Because I was smiling at you?
You were not.
I was not smiling at you. Okay, so that's why you were lying. Okay. But you remember you said that several times. I kept asking you. And you always said you could use your left hand fine, that there was no problem.
Before I had my stroke, I could, but I can't now.
You can't now.
One of Mrs. Sinclair's comments was so odd that it was hard to know whether she was joking or not.
The other striking thing we saw in Mrs. Sinclair, when we held her right hand up to her and asked her, whose hand is this? She said, it's my hand. When I held her left hand up in front of her, she said, that's my husband's hand. And she remembers vividly seeing her husband's hand. Do you remember at that time I showed you your hand? Did I show you anybody else's hand?
Yeah, you showed me my husband's hand.
I showed you your husband's hand. You remember that clearly, do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been living with him 27 years, I know his hand.
You know where his hand is. You've been with him for so many years. That's true, yes. We never showed her husband's hand. In fact, he was not even in the room. Now, to understand what's going on in these patients, you have to look at the left and right cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Now, everyone realizes, of course, that there's specialization. The left hemisphere is specialized for language, and the right hemisphere is thought to be specialized for seeing faces, seeing facial expression, and to some extent for emotions. But I think there's an even more fundamental distinction between the two cerebral hemispheres, and that might help explain this peculiar syndrome you're seeing in these patients. There is a tremendous need in each one of us to create a coherent belief system, to maintain a sense of continuity to our own lives. And this is done largely by the left hemisphere, this creation of a belief system. And when there are new experiences, the left hemisphere folds these experiences into the pre-existing belief system. If something doesn't quite fit the story, the strategy of the left hemisphere is to deny the anomaly, is to pretend it doesn't exist, is to brush it under the carpet. And this is what we call denial. Now, counterbalancing this is the right hemisphere, which has the opposite tendency. Whereas the left hemisphere tries to preserve the model, preserve the belief system, preserve status quo, the right hemisphere is your devil's advocate, constantly challenging the status quo. And when the discrepancy or anomaly becomes unbearably large, or becomes too large, then the right hemisphere forces a complete revision in your worldview, in your belief system. Now, what has happened to these patients is the left hemisphere is intact, so it's engaging in denial, as it does in normal people, but she doesn't have a counterbalance. There's no right hemisphere challenging the story, doing a reality check, and therefore they become more and more deeply delusional, and in fact there is no limit to the delusions that you can elicit, including a claim that her arm belongs to her husband, or saying, yes, I can see my finger touch your nose.
Ramachandran has found support for this radical theory from evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, who is a world authority on self-deception and lying.
To me, what's striking about Ramachandran's work is that he's located a particular kind of self-deception in a particular place in the brain with the pleasing implication that the two hemispheres may normally act together in a way where one is tending to generate more self-deception, the other tending to correct for it. And with anosognosia, you get the self-deception unchecked by the parallel hemisphere. What is striking is how blatant and obvious the self-deception is. They deny the very condition that they express.
When the stroke occurred, could you use it? Now, one way to think about anosognosia is to realize that what the patient is doing is engaging in precisely the kinds of denials and confabulations and rationalizations that we all engage in.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It was Freud who first pointed out that we use all these mental tricks to defend the ego, as he said. When we are confronted with something that's unpleasant or threatening to your self-esteem, you need to lie.
Listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have
The trouble is, the emotional centers of your brain cannot conceal the fact that you're not speaking the truth, and your face starts leaking traces of deceit. So anybody watching you, the muscles are slightly different when you're lying.
Different on each side of the face, reflecting the complementary roles of each side of the brain.
It's almost humorous.
If you put a false expression on your face, a forced smile, it will tend to curl up a bit more on the right side of the face because it's being run by the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more involved in a natural facial expression, so if I could smile warmly at you now, it's supposed to curl up a bit more on the left side because it's supposed to be run by the right brain.
You know, I have acknowledged that I made a mistake, said that
It was interesting to me that President Clinton, when he came out and started apologizing, initially there was a facial imbalance. The right face was into it. The left face said, "Get me the hell out of here." And then he goes before ministers and says, "There's no simple way of saying I've sinned."
And after I testified,
Both faces were now into the latest show.
I don't think there is a fancy way to say that I have sinned.
The bizarre syndrome of anosognosia, I think, gives you an experimental lever to understand these very fundamental aspects of human nature. The consistency of beliefs that we hold about the world is something we take for granted. It's the basis of a rational, sane existence. Even that is called into question in these patients. You cannot talk to a patient who has the syndrome of anosognosia, somebody who's perfectly lucid and intelligent, telling you that this arm belongs to her husband. You cannot confront a patient and not come face to face with some of the basic questions in philosophy. Some of the most fundamental questions you can ask yourself as a conscious human being. What is the self? What is a belief? What do you mean by willing an action? What brings about the unity of your conscious experience? The exciting thing for me is that scientists can now begin to raise and answer some of these lofty questions about how the brain generates conscious experience and generates your sense of self. Wouldn't it be exciting if all this happened in our lifetime, that consciousness finally understood itself?
Next week, Dr. Ramachandran continues his exploration of how the brain creates human consciousness by investigating 3 strange disorders of the visual system. These lead him deep into the emotional areas of the brain and ultimately to ask one of the biggest questions of all. Might there be a kind of God spot, hardwired into the brain, that makes us all open to religious experience?
And that's at 8 o'clock.